There are stories whispered in old towns that should never be spoken aloud, yet they linger like smoke in the rafters curling into the lungs of anyone who dares breathe them. In the Bishopsons were one such story. A family so beloved, their name carried a sweetness in every mouth, a charm that cloaked their every step, and yet behind the warmth, behind the kind smiles, behind the church bells that rang for them alone, lay a secret that gnawed at the foundation of the town itself. Imagine arriving at dusk, the houses glowing with hearthlight, the cobblestones slick with rain, and there at the edge of the square, a family whose presence drew every eye like a magnet. The Bishopsons carried an aura of unshakable grace. The father upright with a voice that soothed the bitterest quarrels, the mother radiant with kindness that poured like wine into every heart, and their children glowing with the innocence that made others ache with envy. The town gave to them freely. Bread, milk, coin, and labor doors opened without question. Debts forgiven with smiles. The Bishopsons needed nothing, for the town itself seemed willing to give them all. Yet, none questioned why or how. It happened, for their charm was not like ordinary love. It was heavier, deeper, a sweetness laced with compulsion, the kind that leaves you empty when you are away from it, longing to return, as though your very spirit is leashed. Behind their home stood an old stone well, older than the church, older than the cobbles around it, a well that no one remembered digging yet, had always been there as though carved into the land before men laid claim to it. The Bishopsons guarded it fiercely, never letting others draw water from it. They said it was tainted, brackish, unfit for drinking, and the town believed them without question. Yet at night some swore they heard voices rising from its depths, faint echoes that carried on the damp wind like hymns sung by oaken throats. This was the seed of unease. For love too perfect is never without its shadow, and whispers grew that the family's grace came not from devotion nor sacrifice, but from something fed and hidden, something that drank when no eyes were watching the truth, that if the well were ever emptied, what lay beneath would strip away every illusion and expose the bargain the Bishopsons had made. The Bishopsons walked through the town like saints, crowned in mortal flesh. Yet saints do not inspire the kind of hunger that clung to them. People longed to be near them, to serve them, to kneel in their presence. Though none dared admit it aloud, it was as though an unseen hand pressed against their chests, urging devotion, demanding loyalty. Their charm was no longer kindness, it was compulsion, a weight in the air that suffocated dissent. Children followed them in the streets, their laughter hollow as though borrowed from another time. Mothers found themselves offering gifts they could scarcely afford, and fathers bent their heads in obedience, even when it cost their pride. No one asked why, for the asking itself felt dangerous. A crime against the order that had taken root. All that mattered was keeping the Bishopsons pleased, because when they smiled the town felt whole, but when they frowned, the air turned colder and darker than winter itself. It was the priest who first began to sense the rot within. He had watched generations of his flock rise and fall, yet never had he seen such control in silence. Alone, a family that preached no sermons, gave no commandments, yet bound hearts tighter than Scripture. One evening after Mass, he lingered by the Bishopson's pew, tracing the indentations left on the wood. As though searching for signs of claws, he felt in his bones that the family was not blessed. They were fed. Behind their house the well breathed like a living thing. No water was ever drawn, no bucket lowered. Yet mist rose from it even on dry nights, drifting across the garden like the sigh of something that had waited too long. Travelers sometimes claimed to hear weeping from its depths, while others swore they saw pale hands pressing against the stone walls trying to climb free. The Bishopsons dismissed it with laughter, telling the townsfolk it was the wind in the rock, the echo of empty earth. And did the people believe them because to disbelieve was to break the spell? But one storm-torn evening, a boy too curious for his own life crept to the well. After midnight, lightning cracked across the sky, revealing what he thought were faces just below the surface, staring upward, with mouths open as if screaming. Yet no sound reached him. He ran back, trembling. But when he tried to speak, his tongue felt swollen, his throat closed. He never uttered a word again, and within weeks he wasted to nothing, as if the well had claimed his voice for itself. The town carried on in silence, as if the boy had never lived. His family grieving in hushed tones, their sorrow quickly swallowed by the Bishopsons' presence, for whenever they entered a room, grief lightened, suspicion dulled, and even memory itself seemed softened into smoke. It was as though the very act of remembering became dangerous, and the people chose instead to forget. Yet there were cracks in the facade. A merchant once tall and proud grew gaunt, his eyes hollow from nights spent staring toward the Bishopsons' house. He swore that when he closed his eyes, he could hear voices calling from beneath the earth, whispering bargains, promises, commands. He spoke too much, too loudly, and within days his shop mysteriously burned, leaving nothing but ash. The town called it accident. The Bishopsons mourned him publicly, yet their smiles lingered a fraction too long. The priest grew desperate. He began searching through forbidden texts hidden in the church cellar, books sealed away by elders before him, for they spoke of wells that were not wells but mouths, passages between this world and another, places where families could forge pacts, trading loyalty, devotion, and life itself for unnatural favor and power. He read until his eyes bled over the words, his hand trembling as he realized the signs matched too perfectly. The mist, the compulsion, the silence around dissent, the emptying of those who questioned. One night, the priest stood at the Bishopson's gate staring at the shuttered windows as a chill pressed against him. He clutched his cross, but it felt like lead, as though the metal recoiled in their presence. He swore he saw shadows moving inside, yet the house was still and quiet. Then a voice, not from within but from below, drifted to him. From the well behind the home, a voice layered with many tones, men, women, children, all speaking in unison. "Welcome, shepherd. You already belong to us." He fled into the night, but his sermons afterward grew strange, warning his flock not against sin or temptation, but against the danger of forgetting. He urged them to remember who they were, to remember the lives that had slipped away. He spoke of memory as salvation, yet the people grew restless, for his words stung against the sweetness of the Bishopsons' presence. It was then that the first seeds of rebellion against the priest were sown, and the Bishopsons only had to smile to let the people do the rest. The priest could no longer endure the gnawing silence that hung over the town, nor the way his sermons fell on ears dulled by devotion to the Bishopsons. He felt himself unraveling each night as he dreamed of the well, its black mouth gaping wider, the voices beneath it calling him closer, as though they knew his name and every sin he had ever whispered in secret. So he made his way to the Bishopsons' house one moonless night, when the sky itself seemed smothered by something heavier than cloud. He carried no lantern for light, felt unwelcome here. Instead, he clutched only his trembling hands together, and a single relic, a fragment of bone said to belong to a saint, hidden for generations. Within the church vaults, he prayed it would still hold power against the unnatural. The Bishopsons greeted him, not with surprise but with warmth, as though they had been expecting his knock all along. The father, Thomas, leaned against the doorframe, his smile stretched too wide, his eyes shimmering with an unnatural calm behind him. Eleanor held a candle, though its flame burned blue instead of gold. The children Abigail and Samuel stood silent, their gazes fixed upon him, their small faces more solemn than any child should bear. "Come in," Father Thomas said, his voice both inviting and commanding, and though the priest felt every nerve screaming to flee his feet, betrayed him. Carrying him across the threshold, the house smelled of flowers, yet beneath it lingered a chemical sharpness that stung the back of his throat. The air itself seemed too heavy, pressing upon his chest. They sat him at a long wooden table, and Eleanor poured him wine, darker than blood, richer than anything mortal should taste. He refused, but his refusal brought only indulgent smiles, like a child's defiance humored by patient parents. "We know why you've come," Eleanor whispered her voice like a lullaby and a warning to protect them. You must join to. Him to save them you must see, as we see. The children moved in unison, stepping behind the priest, and he felt their small hands rest upon his shoulders, cold yet firm. Thomas leaned closer, his words sinking like hooks into the priest's mind. The town needs us, Father. They always have without us. Their grief consumes them. Their faith collapses. You have felt it yourself. We give them what you cannot. Peace. The priest tried to raise the relic, but his arm faltered heavy as stone. His voice cracked as he attempted a prayer, but the words tumbled into silence. The Bishopson smiled wider, as if the house itself swallowed his plea. He realized then with a shudder that they had been in his dreams. Not the devil, not temptation, but them. Their whispers shaping his thoughts, his fears, his very faith. And from beyond the walls came a sound like the shifting of water, the echo of the well, waiting, hungering, calling. The priest staggered from the Bishopson's home, his skin clammy, his relic cold and useless in his palm. He could not recall how he left. Only that one moment he was seated at their table, and the next he was outside the night air, scraping his lungs raw. The streets were silent. No dogs barked. No windows flickered with lamplight, as if the entire town had withdrawn from him, leaving him abandoned beneath a sky that felt lower, heavier, pressing. His steps betrayed him once more, carrying him down Willow Lane toward the garden behind the Bishopson's house, where the well waited. He had preached there as a boy. When the town held summer picnics, he had drawn water from that well when his throat burned from singing hymns. But now the air around it pulsed with a dread he could almost hear, like a living heartbeat thudding beneath the earth. The stone rim was slick, though no rain had fallen. Moss clung to its edges, yet the green seemed black in the absence of light. The priest leaned forward, though his body begged him to stop, his hand clutching the rim for balance. The darkness inside swallowed everything, swallowing even the moonlight. He whispered a prayer, but the syllables dissolved halfway down his throat. Then he saw it movement deep below. Not water, not reflection, but shifting, pale forms that coiled and uncoiled, like bodies rising and sinking. A ripple passed through them, and from the depths, a sound slithered upward, not quite human, not quite animal. A chorus of whispers layered together so dense, they shook his teeth. Loose words brushing against his mind rather than his ears. Join us, they said, not as command, but as invitation. Join us, and be remembered. Join us and be free from the burden of decay. The priest tried to pull away, but his hands clung to the stone rim of their own accord, his body leaning further forward, his feet braced as if anchored. His reflection, or something wearing his reflection, shimmered on the surface for an instant, not his face but a hollow-eyed mockery. His mouth curved into a smile that was not his own. He screamed, but the sound never escaped. Instead, it was devoured by the well, swallowed like all things drawn into its depth. And for the first time, he understood the town had never been safe from the Bishopsons. It had been claimed by them from the very beginning, not through violence, but through something worse, a seduction of the spirit. And as he stumbled back, retching his gaze caught the Bishopsons standing at the edge of the garden, their silhouettes perfectly still, watching silently, as if they had led him here all along. The priest returned to the church, his robes drenched with sweat, though the night was cool. His hands trembled so violently the chalice slipped from its shelf, crashing against the stone floor. But he did not pause. He climbed the pulpit, his voice shattering the midnight silence as he called the faithful from their beds. One by one, doors creaked open. Figures emerged, lanterns flickering across tired faces. The townspeople gathered before him, confused murmurs carrying through the pews. But the priest paid them no mind. He lifted his arms and shouted, of the well, of what he had seen, of the pale forms drifting below, and of the voices that had promised him freedom from decay. He told them the Bishopsons were not what they seemed, that their kindness was a veil, and that behind their smiles lay hunger. Yet as he spoke, his words seemed to fall heavy and lifeless upon the congregation. Their faces did not twist in horror, but softened as if lulled into comfort. The very name Bishopson stirred, not suspicion, but warmth. Neighbors whispered to one another, nodding that the Bishopsons had given generously to the poor, that they had nursed the sick through the influenza, that they had raised their children with gentleness and grace. Who was he to say otherwise? The priest slammed his hand against the altar, his eyes wild, demanding they listen. His voice cracked into a scream, but their eyes glazed over, not with disbelief, but with something deeper, as if a spell had been woven into their memory, twisting loyalty into chains. One elder rose from the pew, speaking calmly with a kindness that felt like mockery. "Father, you are unwell. You are overworked. You see shadows where there is only light." The congregation nodded, murmuring prayers, not for their protection but for his sanity. And in that moment he knew he stood alone, not because they doubted him, but because the Bishopsons had already planted their seeds long ago. Go entwining roots around every heart in town. The well did not need to swallow them. They had already been consumed. As the parishioners drifted away, returning to their homes, the priest collapsed against the pulpit, his body shaking with rage and despair. And through the high windows he glimpsed the Bishopsons standing in the lamplight of the street, their hands folded, their eyes locked upon him in patient silence, as though waiting for him to exhaust himself before their game truly began. The priest could not sleep that night. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the Bishopsons standing outside the church, their pale faces turned toward him with that calm, unnatural stillness, as if they knew he would eventually break, as if they had no need to rush the hunt. He lit every candle in the rectory and paced the floorboards, his hands clutching the cross until splinters dug into his skin. He searched the scriptures, but each verse bent itself into riddles, words twisting on the page until passages of salvation sounded like veiled instructions for sacrifice. It was then he realized the Bishopsons had not only taken hold of the townspeople, they had rooted themselves in his own mind. At dawn, he staggered into the streets, the town still asleep, a silence so deep it felt staged. He walked to the Bishopson house drawn against his will, its windows shut, its shutters bolted. Yet he heard whispers drifting, as though the walls themselves breathed. He pressed his ear to the wood and caught fragments. Words of preservation of time arrested a flesh that should not rot. He felt his knees weaken as the whispers slid into his bones, echoing in his skull like prayers that did not belong to God. He fled, but every corner he turned, the Bishopsons seemed to appear standing at doorways, sitting on porches, their smiles thin and unblinking. Neighbors greeted them with affection, passing bread or kind words, unaware or unwilling to see the way their shadows bent wrong against the ground. The priest tried to shout again, but his throat closed, the words trapped as if strangled by unseen hands. By nightfall, he returned to the well, trembling with the certainty that only there would he find proof enough to shatter the spell. But when he peered down, the water had risen, covering everything that once revealed itself. Only the moon reflected back at him, smooth, unbroken, hiding the pale forms below, as though they had never been there. The well itself mocking him with silence, and then a voice behind him, soft, steady, unmistakable. "Father, you look so very tired." Thomas Bishopson stood only a few paces away, a lantern in his hand casting no light upon his own face. His wife emerging at his side, her eyes glistening with something more than reflection. Together they stepped closer, moving with the patience of those who had already decided the outcome. The air between them thickened like the world itself held its breath. The priest's chest burned as if invisible hands pressed against his ribs, urging him to kneel. "Thomas." Bishopson spoke again, his tone warm, yet carrying the weight of something ancient, something that stripped away willpower, like leaves torn from a dying tree. "Father, you should not wander at night. The dark here is not kind to those who question what they were never meant to see." His wife Anna stepped forward, her presence colder than the night, her smile stretched just enough to reveal teeth that seemed too sharp. When the lantern swayed, its glow bent strangely around her face, as though light itself refused to settle upon her skin. She tilted her head and whispered, "You called us saints. Once you raised our names in blessing, but blessings have a price, do they not? And every town must pay its tithe." The priest tried to raise his cross, but his arm trembled. The metal weighed as if carved from stone. His knees buckled as whispers surged again, now not from the well, but from every direction. The walls of houses, the ground itself, the leaves shivering with syllables of a language older than the land, older than the church. The sound drove nails into his mind, twisting thought into terror. Thomas reached out his hand as if offering peace. Yet in his palm lay not comfort but a shard of bone, pale smooth, too small to be animal, too perfectly shaped to be coincidence. The priest recognized it, though his mind screamed against admitting it. It was human, not fresh yet, not decayed, as if preserved in a place where time obeyed other masters. The priest staggered back, the cross clattering into the dirt. His voice broke free at last, screaming to the empty windows of the town. "Do you not see them? They are not what they claim, but not a curtain stirred, not a lock turned. The town slept or pretended to sleep, wrapped in the same paralysis that gripped his soul." Anna leaned closer, her eyes catching the lantern glow for the first time, and in that instant, the priest saw her irises ripple like water around a sinking stone. She whispered again, low and final, "Father, stop resisting. You are already ours." The priest collapsed to his knees, clutching his head, as if the weight of unseen voices pressed into his skull. The whispers no longer came from the Bishopsons alone. They roared from the earth itself, the cobblestones beneath him pulsing faintly, as though blood surged beneath the town's foundations. Thomas Bishopson's figure seemed to bend and stretch in the lamplight, not breaking form, but shifting just enough that his humanity appeared like a costume ill-fitting and ancient. The priest gasped prayers in half-formed words, yet every sacred syllable he tried to summon unraveled in his throat, as though another force inside him rewrote his speech. Anna circled him, her footsteps silent, though the ground should have betrayed her. She carried the lantern now, its flame twisting blue and black, flickering against shadows that seemed to pull toward her, instead of retreating. "Father," she said gently, almost like a mother, calming a frightened child. "We never deceived the town. They deceived themselves. They saw prosperity and comfort, and they clothed us in holiness. All we did was accept their faith and feed what was hungry." Her words dripped like honey yet stung like venom, each sentence a hook sinking deeper into the priest's crumbling resolve. Thomas crouched eye to eye with him, his presence suffocating, his smile thin, yet unshakably calm. "Tell me, Father, when you prayed for rain, and it came when you prayed for illness to pass, and it vanished, did you thank your God, or did you thank us? And when the well was filled again with water, sweet and clear, did you ever ask what nourished it?" The priest felt his stomach wrench bile rising, as he remembered the taste of that water, the relief in the faces of his people, the way children had laughed at its return. But behind the sweetness lay a metallic tang he had ignored, dismissed as imagination. And now that memory returned sharp and undeniable, Anna extended, the shard of bone closer, placing it in the priest's palm. Though his body shook, he could not resist its weight. It burned cold, searing into his skin like ice, yet left no mark, no wound, no blood. Her whisper caressed his ear. "You hold proof, Father. Yet you will still call us holy, because the town wills it, so they want miracles, not truth." As he stared at the fragment, a realization clawed through his chest. Every miracle, every answered prayer, every full belly in the town had been purchased not from heaven, but from flesh. The priest staggered to his feet, the shard of bone clutched in his trembling hand, his cassock torn from the dirt, his breath ragged, but his eyes alight with a final ember of defiance. He could not allow this to remain buried beneath silence. If the town had been blinded by comfort, then he would tear the veil away, no matter the cost. He stumbled back toward the church, each step heavy as though invisible chains sought to drag him down. The Bishopsons did not follow, not with force, not with hands. Instead, their presence lingered like smoke filling the air around him. Thomas's voice coiled into his mind as if whispered directly from within his skull. You cannot change their faith. Father, they do not want salvation, only continuity, only the dream we provide. The bells of the church loomed above him, cold and unmoving. He burst through the doors, slamming them shut behind him. Though some part of him knew the wood offered no true barrier. He staggered toward the altar, clutching the bone, like a relic of damnation. Candles guttered out as he passed one by one, plunging the sanctuary into trembling darkness. He seized the great iron bell rope and pulled with what strength remained. The toll thundered through the night, shaking roofs and walls, echoing down every street, waking the town in violent alarm. Windows lit one by one as the people stirred, confused, fearful, drawn by the summons they had long been taught to obey. With the last of his voice he cried into the night, come see what holiness has truly fed you." His words shattered against the silence of the pews, echoing hollow, yet carried through the village square. People began to gather their faces, pale in lantern glow, whispering questions to one another, their eyes wide at the sight of their priest, trembling, wild-eyed, clutching a bone like sacred evidence. When he raised it high above the altar, the whispers began again. Not from the crowd, but from the stone of the church itself, vibrating through the walls, a language so old it defied syllables. The villagers flinched, many clutching their ears, yet none fled. They stood still as statues, their gazes locked on the priest, their mouths half open, but no sound escaping. The Bishopson stepped into the doorway, framed by the failing light. Anna's smile soft, Thomas's face calm, their presence a balm to the gathering crowd, and in that moment the priest understood the depth of his failure. Their faith was already sealed. They belonged not to him, not to God, but to them. The congregation filled the church, their faces pale, but their eyes fixed not with fear of the Bishopsons, but with suspicion toward the priest. The man who had always stood as their shepherd now appeared ragged, trembling, holding a bone that glowed strange beneath the candlelight. When he raised it high, demanding, "They see truth," the crowd only murmured uncertain. Then Anna stepped forward, her hand gently brushing the air, her presence pouring calm across them like oil on troubled waters. "My children," she said, her voice lilting, almost maternal. "Do not fear our priest. He has carried a heavy burden too long. Perhaps his mind frayed by the endless weight of your prayers. He sees monsters where there are none. He mistakes the blessings you drink for curses because he cannot comprehend their source." Her words flowed not as argument, but as soothing balm, and the villagers nodded their shoulders, loosening their fear, dissolving into shame for doubting her. Thomas moved closer, his shadow stretching across the altar until it enveloped the priest. He did not raise his voice. He did not threaten. He only asked with gentle power, "Father, why do you clutch that bone like a weapon when it was placed in your hand as a gift? The way a mother offers bread to a starving child. Will you strike those who love you with the very proof of our generosity?" The priest's throat burned with rage. He tried to shout to tell them what they truly drank from the well, that every miracle was bought in blood. But when the words left his mouth, they bent into nonsense, twisted syllables that made no sense, even to his own ears. The villagers gasped, pulling back, not in fear of the Bishopsons, but in horror of their priest. He dropped to his knees, clawing at his own lips, trying to force words out, but his tongue seemed wrapped in threads of invisible silk, binding him from speech. Tears welled as he pounded the stone floor, crying soundless. Sly, while Anna leaned close, her whisper threading through his collapse. "We told you, Father. Stop resisting. They have chosen, and it is not you." The villagers looked on, some pitying, some stern. One man stepped forward muttering, "He is ill. He has lost himself to grief." Others nodded, their gazes shifting to the Bishopsons with reverence, as though they were the only anchor left steady amid the storm. The priest felt the last shreds of his authority crumble into dust. The people he had sworn to protect saw him now as the danger, while the true threat stood embraced by their love. The priest's chest heaved as though fire burned within his ribs, yet the words still would not come. He crawled across the altar, clawing at the stone with bloodied fingertips, the bone shard still clenched in his fist. He raised it high once more, pointing not at the Bishopsons, but at the church doors. His eyes wide with frantic clarity, he wanted them to follow him, not to his pulpit, not to prayer, but to the well. With a groan of effort, he staggered upright, leaning on the altar for support. His voice cracked raw, yet for one brief moment, it broke through the threads that bound him. The well. He rasped the well behind their home. Come, see it with your own eyes. A ripple moved through the crowd, uncertainty trembling like wind through tall grass. Whispers spread, and for a heartbeat, doubt flickered across a few faces. The Bishopsons watched quietly, neither moving to stop him nor to encourage him their stillness. A snare in itself. The priest lurched forward down the aisle, villagers stepping back as he passed some, in pity others in disgust. He shoved the doors wide and staggered into the night, the bell still groaning above his head, its echoes fading across the valley. He turned back, his face streaked with tears and sweat, and screamed with everything left in him. You drink the dead. Gasps broke among the crowd, their lanterns swaying in nervous hands. Yet still they followed, compelled not by faith in him, but by the sickness of curiosity. The Bishopsons stepped gracefully into the moonlight, their eyes catching silver. Their hands entwined, a silent procession formed behind the priest, all moving toward the black silhouette of the well at the edge of the Bishopson property. The priest reached it first, falling to his knees beside its stone rim, his hands trembling as he clawed at the lid that sealed it shut. His fingernails, split blood streaking across the weathered wood. He sobbed, not from weakness, but from desperation. If you would only look, if you would only hear what it speaks in the dark, you would never bow again. The villagers halted their lanterns, swaying their faces half hidden in shadow. The Bishopsons stepped forward. Their calm, unbroken Anna's whisper floated through the stillness like a lullaby. Father, there is no need to open it. They are not ready to see. And in their hearts, they do not wish to see. The priest screamed in defiance, and with one final heave he ripped the cover loose. Darkness surged upward, not empty air, but a breath like something alive rising to meet them. The lid crashed aside, and the night exhaled a stench that no language could name. It was not rot alone, not damp soil or stagnant water. It was the reek of endings, the breath of something that had consumed and yet never digested. The crowd recoiled, hands over mouths, lanterns shaking as the fumes slithered into their lungs. The priest leaned over the rim, lantern light spilling down the shaft, and what it revealed froze the marrow of every man, woman and child who dared to look. Bodies lined the stones stacked like offerings, some shriveled as if drained, others pale as wax, their eyes glassy wide, forever caught in a silent scream, but none decayed. They were preserved as though the well itself had claimed dominion over time. Children, women, men, all ages, their faces too familiar to deny missing townsfolk, whispered away as travelers lost to storms or sickness now staring back with lips stiff and blue. The villagers staggered back in horror, many collapsing to their knees. A woman shrieked, covering her child's eyes, yet unable to tear her own gaze from the abyss. The priest raised the shard of bone above him, his voice cracking but stronger than it had been in years. Do you see? Do you see what nourishes your blessings? This is your miracle. This is the water that filled your bellies and healed your fevers. The crowd wailed, confusion tearing through them, some reaching to flee, but rooted by shock, others clutching each other for strength. The Bishopsons stood unmoving, their faces calm, untouched by guilt. Thomas finally stepped forward, his tone unshaken. This is what you begged for. Every prayer, every desperate cry for relief you asked. And we answered. Do not recoil from your own bargain. Anna's voice followed, weaving through the trembling crowd. You never questioned the cost. You never asked what price fed your comfort. You chose ignorance, and ignorance has always been the sweetest sacrament. The priest turned to them, his eyes blazing. "You call it sacrament. I call it slaughter." He pointed to the crowd, his voice rising in fury. "They have been deceived, their souls poisoned, their faith chained to demons in human skin." But even as he spoke, the villagers began to shift their gazes no longer toward the well, but toward him. Their expressions clouded, torn between horror and denial, between gratitude and dread. The unthinkable truth pressed against their minds, yet the Bishopson's presence wrapped them in a cradle of calm, urging them to reject the unbearable for the comfort of obedience. The priest felt it. Then the war was no longer for their eyes, but for their will, and it was slipping away. The villagers clutched each other, trembling their lanterns, casting wild shadows across the stone rim of the well. The priest stood bloodied, bone shard in hand, his voice a desperate fire, but the Bishopsons needed only calm to smother it. Thomas raised his hand, not in threat, but in reassurance, and the murmurs in the crowd softened like children soothed from nightmares. "Brothers, sisters," he said, his tone warm as a father's embrace. "You see what lies within the well, but ask yourselves this question: when the storms ravaged your crops, who saved you? When the fevers burned through your children, who pulled them back from the grave? When thirst clawed your throats, who gave you water sweeter than life itself? Was it this man at the altar, or was it us?" The crowd wavered, some still pale with horror, yet their eyes drawn to the Bishopsons like moths to steady flame. Anna stepped forward, her beauty ethereal, her voice velvet over glass. "You fear the bones because you still cling to lies of innocence, but you have always known in your hearts that life feeds upon life. Every meal, every drink, every breath carries a sacrifice. Why should miracles be exempt?" the priest cried out. "No, these are your neighbors, your kin. You consumed them without consent, without knowledge. You turned their deaths into worship. You have chained this town to a covenant with death itself." His words cut the night sharp and raw, but the villagers shrank from him as though his fury were the greater danger. Thomas's gaze fixed on him, serene, but edged with power. "Father, it was never chains, it was choice. Though they asked without knowing, they chose without seeing, and we gave without failing. Do not twist their devotion into betrayal. They know the truth now, and still they stand with us." The villagers murmured louder, some nodding through tears, others clutching their children to their chests. Yet not stepping away from the Bishopsons, one man shouted, "Better their bones in the well than our children in the grave." His words cracked, but others echoed them, the air thickening with twisted gratitude. The priest's heart sank as the crowd swayed toward the Bishopsons, their faith no longer shaken, but reforged, stronger, bound by fear and selfish need. He held the bone aloft, screaming into the void. "You are blind. They are not saviors. They are the end of all that is human." But his words found no purchase, drowned beneath the rising murmur of voices pledging themselves anew. The priest's voice tore through the night, but it was swallowed by the tide of murmurs, the crowd no longer recoiling from the Bishopsons, but pressing closer to them, drawn by invisible threads of devotion. The bone shard weighed heavy in his hand, as if it too had turned against him. His faith faltered, yet his fury burned brighter, knowing this was his last chance to strike against the power that had consumed them all. He lifted the shard high above his head, the moonlight catching its pale surface, and for a heartbeat, the crowd hushed their eyes. Locked on him, some with pity, others with rage, he shouted with every fragment of breath left in his lungs, "They are not holy. They are not your saviors. They are the devourers of your souls. If you kneel tonight, you will never rise again." For the first time, Thomas Bishopson's calm cracked a ripple of darkness flickering across his face, his eyes glinting with something vast and ancient. His voice deepened, carrying weight that pressed into bone and marrow. "Enough, Father. You have spoken your last." Anna glided forward, her steps soundless, her gaze fixed on the priest with cold tenderness, as if she pitied a dying child. She extended her hand not to strike, but to claim whispering softly, "Come rest. You have struggled enough. Surrender and let silence take you." The villagers shifted uneasily, some torn between their love for the Bishopsons and the image of their priest trembling bloodied and defiant. One woman cried out, "Save him! Father, please save yourself." But the plea was drowned by others calling, "Stand down! End this madness!" The priest's hand trembled, but instead of surrender, he turned the shard of bone upon himself, pressing its edge to his palm until blood welled scarlet against white. His voice broke, but carried a fire that no chain could bind. "If you will not see, then I will show and let my blood be the seal of truth." The ground quaked faintly the while, spurs from the well, rising to a fever pitch as if answering his defiance. The crowd gasped, lanterns swaying shadows writhing across the earth. The Bishopsons stood unmoving, but their eyes darkened, their serene masks stripped away, revealing something vast and merciless, staring through human skin. The priest raised his bleeding hand toward the villagers, his blood dripping like crimson fire upon the stones. "You drink death, but tonight you will see it alive. You will." The earth trembled as the priest's blood struck the stones, each drop sinking into the soil, as though swallowed by a thirsty mouth. The memorial ground groaned like something long buried, straining against its prison. The villagers staggered back, yet their eyes clung to the Bishopsons, who stood unflinching. Their smiles sharpened into masks of hunger. The well pulsed beneath the garden, though it had been filled and sealed with stone and prayer. Its breath returned, rising in foul exhalations that stank of rust and rot. The flowers planted there wilted, in an instant their petals curling black. The water that was not water pressed against the seal until cracks splintered outward, glowing faintly, as if the earth itself bled light. Thomas Bishopson raised his arms as though greeting an old friend. His voice deep and resonant carried across the crowd. "We told you the work could not be buried. We told you death is only a door tonight. You see the truth unbroken." Anna's laughter followed soft and lilting like a lullaby as the villagers began to scream, yet many could not flee their feet, rooted as if chained by invisible vines, their faces twisted between terror and adoration. Some clawed at their own chests as if something inside demanded release, while others fell to their knees whispering words not their own. The priest stumbled forward, blood dripping from his hand onto the earth, with every step his voice hoarse but unyielding. "You will not take them. You will not have them." He lifted the bone shard now slick with his blood and thrust it toward the glowing cracks, his body convulsing as the whispers surged through him. From beneath the ground a shape pressed against the surface not fully formed yet, vast and writhing like a shadow trying to crawl into flesh. The villagers shrieked, some covering their eyes, while others reached out as if longing to embrace it. The Bishopsons glowed with an unearthly light, their forms stretching as though they were no longer bound entirely by human skin. The priest fell to his knees but held the shard high, his blood spilling faster, the light from the cracks flaring brighter until it painted every face in ghostly fire. The ground roared, the air thick with the sound of 1,000 voices, none human, all crying for release, and for a moment it seemed the earth itself might split and swallow Millbrook whole. The ground beneath the memorial garden erupted in a shattering roar, soil, stone, and bone fragments hurled into the air like shrapnel. The filled well burst open, vomiting forth blackened water that boiled as it touched the night air. The stench of decay rolled over the town like a suffocating wave, and with it came the sound of voices, hundreds, thousands, all crying from beneath the earth, their words twisted into one demand release. From the churning pit rose forms neither solid nor spirit bodies, half dissolved, yet writhing with hunger. Eyes like burning coals opening where no faces should be. The victims of the Bishopsons dragged from their false sleep, bound together by chemicals and curse. Their flesh bubbled like wax, yet their mouths still moved, calling for names, calling for vengeance, calling for Thomas and Eleanor, as if they were both tormentors and saviors. The Bishopsons stood upon the cracked stones like monarchs returned to their throne. Thomas's eyes glowed white, his voice carrying over the wails. Behold the children of our work. Behold the proof that death can be conquered. Eleanor lifted her hands, and the wraith-like shapes bent toward her as if pulled by invisible chains, their bodies straining to obey even in their ruin. The villagers screamed. Some fled into the woods, their torches scattering like fireflies. Others collapsed, overcome by visions forced into their minds. Every lost face of every victim, staring back at them, whispering, "Do you see? Do you see what they made of us?" And still others fell into rapture, their voices joining the chorus of the Bishopsons, as if eager to be consumed. The priest dragged himself closer, blood still flowing from his hand, his face pale as ash, but his eyes fierce. He raised the shard above his head, one final time, his voice breaking yet sharp as steel. "You have unchained your dead, but you will not unchain yourselves." He plunged the shard into tea. The ground buckled, screaming like a wounded beast, and the dead shrieked in fury, their forms collapsing into waves of black mist. The Bishopsons staggered, but their smiles remained unfaltering, as the mist curled around them like a cloak. Thomas whispered almost tenderly, "This is only the beginning. We have shown them. The veil is thin, and it cannot be sealed again." The veil between life and death trembled like a torn curtain. Wind roared through Millbrook. Though no storm touched the sky, the town became a single heartbeat pulsing with dread, every soul aware that the Bishopsons stood at the center of the wound they had ripped open. Thomas spread his arms, his voice low yet resonant enough to shake windows from their frames. "We are not fugitives. We are architects, and you are all living inside the cathedral we have built from bone and silence." The ground churned around the pit, the forms of the half-dead dissolving into smoke. Yet their voices remained carried on the wind, their cries weaving into words, repeated over and over. "Not free. Not free. Not free." Eleanor pressed her hands to the earth, whispering in rhythm with them, her body trembling as though channeling the voices through her veins. Her children stood behind her, their faces blank, their eyes shining with the same glow their parents bore. Indoctrinated vessels of a vision the town could not comprehend. The priest collapsed. His strength drained the shard, buried deep. His voice, a rasp. "The garden is yours now. Take the weight. Take the curse. Millbrook must live free of it." A hush spread, as though the world held its breath. Then a violent crack split, the nightlight surged from the wound, a blinding column stretching skyward, searing tree lines and burning away the mist. Within the light, faces flickered too fast to count all the Bishopsons' victims, their forms no longer ruined, but whole. Their mouths closed, their eyes calm as they drifted upward, vanishing one by one into the sky. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the Bishopsons screamed, the sound not of pain, but of fury, raw, endless fury. Their work undone, their proof, dissolved, their legacy torn from their grasp. Thomas clawed at the light, his body writhing. Eleanor beat her fists against the ground until her bones snapped, yet she howled louder. Our children wailed, collapsing into heaps like puppets with strings cut. The light consumed them all, leaving only scorched stone and silence. But Millbrook did not cheer. No voices rose in triumph, because the absence itself was heavy, as though the Bishopsons were not gone, only hidden like wolves sinking beneath water, waiting to surface again. The garden lay still, but the villagers knew the curse was not destroyed, merely shifted. The inscription on the stone marker glowed faintly as though newly carved for those lost for lessons, learned for a community that endures. And in the quiet, a final whisper threaded through every ear. Not a human voice, but something older, deeper, closer than breath. Trust is a mask. Trust is a weapon. Never forget. The Bishopsons had vanished, but their shadow stretched across time, and every man who walked away that night carried the seed of their doctrine, whether in fear, in suspicion, or in the secret thought of what power could be seized if one dared to cross the veil again.